Alright, strap in, because this one is most likely gonna upset you and the Guild Wars 2 player base as a whole. See, while I was working on a lore video about how Guild Wars 2's story could potentially end now that the Elder Dragons are gone, and that we're exploring, or rather re-exploring the Mersat, Titans, and maybe even some Abaddon lore, who for the uninitiated is the reason just about every single bad thing happened in the Guild Wars story in the past 2 decades, I stumbled across something rather interesting. See, in my search, I decided to not limit myself to the in-game lore or the extra details we have on the wiki, but I also decided to score through NCSoft's quarterly reports and press conferences, as well as about every single listed and unlisted page on the ArenaNet website. And if you've been keeping up with the news in the past 2 years, you already know that ArenaNet has been looking for developers to work on an unannounced project in Unreal Engine 5. Now at first they were mainly looking for hires that could help transfer assets from one engine to another, which caused a bit of speculation whether Guild Wars 2 would be getting a graphical overhaul. But then that speculation shifted to them working on an MMO for a completely different IP. And even later, after taking a statement from NCSoft out of context, the whole community at large ran with the narrative that Guild Wars 3 was under development. But they also accepted that making an MMO would take time so that it wouldn't be released anytime soon. What if I told you that all of that is wrong? Well, maybe not the hiring, and not the fact that there is actually an as of yet unannounced project. But it won't be an MMORPG nor a collectible card game as other sources previously suggested once people discovered the Lion's Arch Arena page on SteamDB. That page is still on there by the way, and has also been getting frequent updates since October of last year. But I'm pretty sure it's not a card game because of some of the hiring ArenaNet has been doing. Now before I get into the specifics, let's rewind for a second, because it's very important to understand where ArenaNet is coming from. See, the original Guild Wars game was an MMO, but it was more of a mix between Path of Exile with its hubs and instant maps and other popular MMORPGs at the time with its tab targeting. The original also enjoyed frequent updates and expansions, adding new zones, new professions, and even new skills for the already existing ones. But in a bit of a turnaround, the studio cancelled the 4th expansion in favor of Guild Wars 2. Kind of a bummer for the fans of the original, especially once they realized that Guild Wars 2 would receive a complete combat overhaul and would be more action based, and that they'd also do away with the holy trinity of a tank, healer and DPS, and that the instant zones, which were so farmable, would be taken away in favor of a shared open world where players wouldn't even have to compete over the same resources. So in 2012 we finally got the Guild Wars 2. And like its predecessor, the game received an almost untenable amount of updates, as we'd not only get balance patches, but also festivals for just about every single major holiday, and on top of that, we'd get so-called living world seasons, that would literally change the way the game was played, or even let players directly influence what type of content would be added next. As I said, the amount of updates were untenable, and we'd eventually hit a slowdown with the time between expansions decreasing, raids being taken off the table in favor of strikes, and the studio even wanting to stop releasing new expansions altogether in favor of updates like the Icebrood Saga. But NCSoft didn't like that one too much, which set off yet another chain of events with the saga being rushed in favor of a new expansion. Now since that last major expansion, things changed drastically once more, as we now have yearly expansions, which they again can't seem to maintain, and they will be shifting the timeline once more to allow for a slower pace. So it's pretty clear that studio resources are lacking, or well, for Guild Wars 2 at least. And that brings us back to how their current resources are being used, which is for a new game obviously. And once that SteamDB page I showed you earlier was discovered, PC gamers suggested this could very well be a collectible card game, which admittedly would fit perfectly with ArenaNet's business model. First of all, they'd be able to add a second active game to their lineup, which would diversify their income, and if other CCGs are an example, I'm pretty sure that the monetization would be on point as well, as instead of gem store skins, we could then be goaded into buying booster packs for stronger decks, or maybe even arenas and avatars for real world currency to still be able to stand out from the rest. Combat-wise, this would also give them a bit of a reprieve from the current balance issues the game is facing, as right now they're trying to strike a balance between 2 competitive modes and endgame PvE, all the while not trying to ruin the open world for the biggest part of their player base, and a CCG would mainly be PvP centered anyway. So a collectible card game isn't a bad guess, except maybe for the fact that it doesn't line up with the types of roles they've been hiring for, as they seemingly already recruited combat designers whose job description included that they'd get to work on a bold new vision for a next-gen MMORPG combat system. And I believe that system is gonna be heavily inspired by MOBAs, which is something they've already been openly experimenting with, mind you. And if you look at some of the other pieces of the puzzle, this seems to fit in pretty well. Now, if you look at both games they've produced so far, we've already been introduced to a whole slew of professions, or classes if you will. Guild Wars 2 has 9 different ones, but each of those also has 3 more elite specializations. And if we then add the ones missing from the original like monks, ritualists and dervishes, we get to a pretty solid roster already. And it also stands to argue that every single of these professions already has an in-game NPC or a hero. If we now think about monetization, which, let's be honest, ArenaNet is pretty good at, considering that they're making more than 90 million per year on Guild Wars 2 alone, a MOBA wouldn't be too far off of the current model. Instead of outfits for your characters, you would now be buying different hero skins. On top of all of this, we also have to factor in that both games, despite being known for the PvE gameplay and the open world, have a very heavy PvP background. As the original had random arenas, a 1v1 arena that would eventually be removed, the Hall of Heroes for quick but more organized PvP, and guild battles with their own ladder, as well as monthly tournaments that could win you a prestige cape. And add to this the fact that every single public figure on the balance team is already more invested in World v World than any other game mode. Then there's also the release of Guild Wars 2, with ArenaNet themselves pushing even harder to turn the game into an esport, as they were hosting their own tournaments and even a world championship with a $25,000 prize pool. Those tournaments have since been sidelined, but we still have structured PvP in the game, which actually comes in 2 modes. The first, and by far the most popular, is a node capture type of game. But the second is actually already pretty close to how a MOBA works. Now there's also something else I haven't mentioned yet, and that is that their newest position they're hiring for is a producer with experience in AAA multi-platform games. The fact that you're looking for a producer indicates that the groundwork is somewhat done, as it wouldn't make sense to hire someone who's an expert in putting all of the puzzle pieces together if there's none to begin with. And since we already know that Guild Wars 3 wasn't even in development when that journalist originally sprung the question on the NCSoft execs, I think it's safe to conclude that it can't realistically be an MMORPG, because those take far longer to develop. Not only do you need to populate a whole world with NPCs, you also have to add dialogue and interactions to them, develop a combat system, develop player interaction systems like a chat, a trading post and so on, and that's before even considering the actual content that needs to be added so that players don't run out of things to do in their first week of playing the game. Developing a MOBA, on the other hand, can be done much quicker, especially if you already have a combat and a balance system in place you can use as the backbone for your next game. And you don't have to worry about a persistent world if every single game resets once it's over anyway. But there is a bit more to this listing, because they are looking for someone with experience in AAA multi-platform game development, indicating that we might not be getting a PC-only game. Path of Exile and Diablo are examples of games that were recently released and are already cross-platform. But if we look at the MOBA space, League of Legends is already doing something similar with Wild Rift, except they're doing it on mobile. And if we now add NCSoft to the equation, we should note that their mobile games unit largely surpasses the PC games one. Now, I understand that you might not be too thrilled hearing about this, but there's one more piece of information that you need that will make all of this come together. And that's that today's April 1st. I made all of this up. Well, except for the job listings, the unannounced project and Lion's Arch Arena. Those are real, but I have no clue what the next game will be about. Anyway, I hope you'll forgive me and be warned, I'm making an even worse video next year.